Minds. I'm joined by Stephanie Cook, an expert on nuclear energy and the use of nuclear weapons, and the author of In Mortal Hands, A Cautionary History of the Nuclear Age. Stephanie, what provoked you, or what motivated you? I asked earlier what got your interest in nuclear power and nuclear weapons. That was a fascinating story. Why this book now? Well,
I'll tell you the actual trigger for the book was what was going on with the first Gulf War in 1991. And I felt very frustrated in the ensuing years that people were expressing so much surprise that we discovered this huge weapons program in Iraq, and that the Made in USA stamp was on some of the equipment we were finding. There was a lot of stuff that had come from Europe. And this was a result of our close relationship with the Iraqis during the 80s and our willingness to look the other way when there were questionable dual-use exports and so on and so forth. But, you know, there's only so many times you can explain this to people at dinner parties or whatever. So you sort of say, well, you know, and I had one very good friend in London who'd written a book about Oppenheimer, about the moral, a novel called America's Children. It's a very, very good novel about his moral conflict, and we talked endlessly about it. And he said, you know, you've got to write about this. People don't understand this. You've got to write about the relationship, because all of this flows out of the trade in the civilian nuclear industry, the fact that he has got all this stuff. And that we had, you know, Pakistan going nuclear and several other countries. And but then as I got into the book and I thought more about it, I thought, you know, how will I do this? And I thought I have to write about the relationship between the military and civilian sides of nuclear power, because they're very inextricably linked, and they're linked through the fuel cycle, as I think I explained earlier.
Now, if I may,
yeah.
We talked about enrichment. My understanding is that you have to enrich uranium up to around 3% for a nuclear power plant and over 90% for a bomb.
Yeah.
That's a real significant difference. Is the fuel cycle different for the two?
No.
How quickly interchangeable is it?
No, you just reconfigure the plant and you just run it through more times, to put it simply.
Just spin them
you use the same equipment. It's the exact same equipment. It's the same technology. You just reconfigure it differently. And it doesn't take that long to do it. But the other thing that was a kind of big elephant in the room for me is that I always felt this talking to people about nonproliferation policy during the 80s. Especially, I had a conversation with somebody from India who said, well, do you think it's fair that you have nuclear weapons? And I never thought about that. I just thought, well, we have them, and that's the way the world is, and we're the big cat on the block, and that's it. But actually, the more I thought of it, the more I thought, we have never discussed in this country, in my lifetime, we have never had a serious national conversation about our relationship to this whole enterprise, to the whole nuclear thing, not just civilian nuclear power, but our weapons establishment, which in 1996, the authors of Atomic Audit said had cost us $5.5 trillion, and is going to cost us something like $175 billion over the next 10 years. I mean, I was at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Doomsday Clock Symposium earlier this year, and there was a wonderful speaker who I'm sure you've heard of called Elaine Scarry, and she pointed out something that really sort of blew my mind. She said, you know, we have 14 Ohio-class nuclear submarines, each of which has enough firepower to decimate a continent. And I checked this, and I believe she's right. There's only 7 continents.
Right.
How much do we need?
There's only 6 that are occupied.
Right,
I mean,
right,
by
exactly.
more than
Good
a few
point.
dozen people.
You'd need an icebreaker for the others, right?
Yeah.
So this is scary, and accidents happen. Maybe accidents are happening as we speak on these that we've never heard of. We don't know, you know. We do know that there's been multiple accidents of Strategic Air Command planes in the air, mid-flight collisions, where they have, and they only carry thermonuclear weapons, as far as I know.
So we have nuclear bombs in the air all the time?
I don't know whether we still have them in all the time, but in the 1980s, there was an incident, I believe it was the 1980s, over Palomares, Spain, a very famous incident where we were refueling in flight, and the planes caught fire, and the 4 bombs dropped to the ground. This happened again in Greenland and Thule. This has happened more than a dozen times.
Wow.
Where these kind of accidents happened. For a while they couldn't find one of the bombs. But anyway, there was radiation spread all over the ground around this poor little village in Spain, and massive cleanup and massive secrecy. Yeah, but they just scattered some of the stuff that was around it. It wasn't like a nuclear explosion, but they scattered the contents of some of the stuff around. So there had to be a cleanup, and this wasn't. But the thing is, apart from wanting the public to know about this, apart from hoping this book would get traction, would become a focal point for discussion about these issues, because they are complicated. I wanted to make it accessible and easy for people to read and understand and grapple with.
And it is, you've done that.
Thank you. But I wanted to talk about this relationship between the two sides, and I wanted to talk about the secrecy and the zealotry, and I wanted to talk about you know, where we go from here, can we get to zero? Is that, you know, are we as a country somebody who wants to be represented, that this is our way of defending ourselves, that we carry around this capability for planetary destruction? I have a real problem with this. I have a real problem that we go to the international courts and combat efforts to declare nuclear weapons illegal and immoral and against all concepts of human rights, because they are, after all, weapons of mass destruction. And the more we keep them here and use them as the bar that anybody else has to reach to be as powerful as we have, as long as we have them, we send that message to the rest of the world. How can we not expect other countries to want to get there too?
You know, there was that moment when Ronald Reagan, and some have suggested this was his early Alzheimer's, when he sat down with Mikhail Gorbachev and said, let's just go to zero.
Yeah.
And Gorbachev said, cool, let's do it. And it was like, we almost got there.
Yeah.
And then
SDI got in the way.
Yeah, a whole bunch of things got in the way. But yeah, Star Wars in particular. And what's it going to take?
It's going to take a tremendous amount of courage, but most of all, it's going to take public awareness. I think that the public in the United States, to the extent they ever think about nuclear weapons, which why would you? It's kind of an uncomfortable area to go to.
Right.
You sort of have a vague sense that maybe they give us security. In fact, they probably don't, but this is something that needs to be talked about more. They probably don't because, yeah, you can go around and muscle yourself around the world and say, I've got them on the aircraft carriers, I've got them on the planes, and I've got them in the submarines. But are you going to use them?
Right.
And if you do use them, what happens? So are they real power? And don't they attract bad feelings to the United States? Is there, I suggest in my book, and it's probably too short of a conversation to go there now, but is there an indirect link even between the way we have behaved in successive wars, where there's always been talk by some crazy guy in the military that we should use nuclear weapons? That, if you look into it far enough, you'll see there's always been somebody that says we should do it. To, you know, things that have happened to us that we don't like. I mean, when you walk around and you're the big guy on the block and you use this to project your power, I think there's consequences.
Mm-hmm. And how does, you talked about tying this back to nuclear power through the fuel cycle. This is the anniversary of Fukushima. Mm-hmm. Beyond the relationship between power, nuclear power, and nuclear mm-hmm. weapons, in that context, in that kind of scientific or clinical context, what's the future of nuclear power in the United States? Are we at risk of a Fukushima or Chernobyl here? And what should we do about that?
You know, we're always, first of all, let's go back to what Hannes Alfvén, the Swedish Nobel laureate, said, I think probably back in the 60s or 70s. He said, acts of God are not permitted with nuclear energy. That applies to Fukushima, and that's for sure. But also, acts of human fallibility are not permitted. And I address this in my book because fallibility is evident in any industry, but in nuclear industry, you can't afford to be fallible.
Browns Ferry, 3
Right.
Mile Island, Fermi.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's this long list of people, you know, going around with a candle inside
yes.
nuclear and catching it. That was Browns.
And at Fukushima, yes, there was a tsunami, but there was a human error. The human error was putting the diesel generators in the basements, and then they have a blackout, and then they have a loss of coolant, and then they have a meltdown, multiple meltdowns. You know, I wrote an article shortly after Fukushima at somebody's request about the possibility of accidents in the United States, and I said everybody's obsessed about the possibility of earthquakes in the United States, but remember there's a million different ways that a nuclear accident can happen. These are very, very complex machines. They look clean when you look at them, and you just picture you see the dome and you think that's clean energy. Look underneath the dome. It's very, very complex. Miles and miles of wiring, thick concrete, very complicated machinery and instrumentation. And so a million things can go wrong, and lots of things do in little ways all the time. I read about it every week, you know, and if too many things go wrong, and the industry has never been able to sequence all the things that could, to put all the sequences together that could go wrong, right, because there's so many of them.
Wow. So what should we do with nuclear power in the last 2 minutes you have here to talk?
Well, I think that we, particularly when we think about overseas, that promoting nuclear power will come with a cost, because you are promoting virtual bomb-making capability when you send technology that way. Secondly, in the United States, I think we should go in a different direction. I think that we already are going in a different direction. I mean, the head of Exelon, John Rowe, has said he doesn't want to build another nuclear power plant right now because natural gas prices are so low. Nuclear power is too expensive, he says. It's also dangerous. I don't know whether how he feels about alternatives. I'm told that, I mean, the way they're going is towards more alternatives. I think the French are going in this direction. The Germans certainly are. I believe that there's indications the Swiss are. Many other countries are. And I don't want to get left behind on that score. I'm not worried about getting left behind on the nuclear thing, because I think it's kind of old world technology in a way. So if we were to say that the 19th century technology, the pre-19th century was coal, 19th century was oil, 20th century was nuclear, 21st century is solar, new wind, and
biomass.
Reconfiguring the grid is going to be very important.
Smart grids.
Smart grids, and our choices of energy will determine a lot about how we configure the grid, so that's something to think about. But I think that we should look, and the reason I wrote this book, apart from getting this discussion about weapons going, is to look at all of nuclear's dangers. Safety, proliferation, waste. We still have no place to put waste, although hopefully we're moving towards a solution. And when you couple all this with human fallibility and very, very complicated technology, you have a recipe for disaster.
So let's start the discussion. Stephanie, thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
To watch this conversation again, as well as other conversations with great minds, go to our website, conversationswithgreatminds.com. Coming up after the break, today is International Women's Day, with a focus on helping women